All right. So basically, there was a number of issues regarding dualism and dichotomies. All right. On the relationship between positive and negative energies, and on the sources of spiritual imagination and right, the imagination of God and that kind of thing. So I saw there were about three major types of questions. Now there were also some really good questions, a number of questions regarding social issues, like what certain aspects of what would it mean to build a better operating system for society, and what would be a good one, and how would that be, and in a sense some broader social related issues. And I think these are good questions, but I won't deal with them today, because actually in the final, especially the final 4 weeks of this class, we'll actually be dealing very directly with a lot of those issues. So still at this stage, we're really talking more about figuring out about the mindscape and kind of at the individual level. And actually, as these 4 weeks have really been much at that level. And then in a sense, the next 4 weeks are going to be about switching different operating systems. So looking at, observing the mindscape through meditation, operating systems relating to the body, and then the relationship between humans and the environment. So it's really going to be about learning to kind of see and experience the world according to the different operating systems that we have in different religions and cosmologies. And then in the final 4 weeks, it's going to be more about some of the social implications and about social operating systems. So right now, okay, so the first issue then I'm going to talk about is on dualism and dichotomies. So there was, okay, first of all, one of you noted, and I think this is a really good point to bring up. So is there's kind of, there is the, especially the last 2 weeks, there was talking about material and spiritual. But then early on, I talked about body, mind, and spirit. And so what's the connection between spiritual material and then spirit, mind, and body? And one of you noted, and I think this is right, quite accurate. So then obviously the body aligns with the material, and the spirit obviously aligns with the spiritual. And then then you mentioned that, okay, well then the mind is kind of also spiritual, right? Because it's not material. And this is a very good point, because this has been debated actually throughout the history of, in the West anyway, it's been debated throughout the history of Christianity, and then in Western philosophy. So for 2,000 years, it's been the question whether we have a threefold kind of conceptualization, or a dualistic conceptualization. And especially starting in the, I believe around the 15th, 16th, and certainly 17th century, the dominant framework became the dualist one. So it became material, spiritual, or body and mind, only two. But actually, there was an earlier conceptualization, which was three-way, and I think it makes more sense. Personally, I think it makes more sense. Because the mind, the rationality, on the one hand, it's true, it's not really material, but the orientation it can go either way. So when we talk about body, mind, and spirit, we're actually not talking about different substances, but we're talking about orientations. So the body is oriented towards bodily survival. So that's like the force, the drive of the body is towards survival, and it's towards, being safety and security, being enough food and things like that. So that drives our motivations in a certain direction. And the spirit is motivated to strive for something more transcendent, some greater ideals, greater meanings, greater purpose, and things like that. And it may take us away from the concern for the survival of the body. So body and spirit, it's not about talking about the substance of it, but it's talking about the direction. the desire, which way are your desires pulling you? And the mind is kind of in between those. So the mind can go either in the direction of the desires of the body. So you can use your mental capacity, your intellectual capacity to strengthen the capacity of your body, or you can use your mind, your intellectual capacities to better understand your spiritual ideals and to find a better way to reach your spiritual ideals. So that's why I think a threefold approach works actually better than a dualistic approach. But both of them have their good reasons. But then the other point, and one of you really mentioned, and I think that's really, really important, is that, why should we even divide the spiritual and the material? Maybe we shouldn't do that. Because in a sense, we can see this, when we've just been talking about the objects of consciousness in the mindscape. And on the one hand, anything material, let's say even snow or your phone or something like that, it has something material, but it always has your own idea is attached to it. And so we tried to use some kind of thought experiments by looking at Sartre, and we're going to look at some meditation practices. These are kind of thought experiments or ways to training the mind to separate that. But actually, most of the time, you will always be combining the material object and the meaning of the object. It's actually impossible, except in a thought experiment or a meditation, really training yourself, training the mind to focus in that way. But most of the time in life, we are always combining the material thing and the meaning that we give to the thing. And and so it can't really, the material and spiritual can't really be separated. So we only separate only in order to temporarily understand better, but then we have to put it back together after that. So this is really important. So, and this is really important whenever we're talking about any kind of theory, any kind of concept. The purpose of a concept is simply to help us understand something, but the concept is can never fully describe the reality. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about religion, or if you're talking about, social science, and even the natural sciences and engineering. You're always building theories using your mental capacity, your intellectual capacity to build a theory to describe the reality, but the theory can only ever partly describe a certain part of reality. So if it's useful to help us understand something, we use it. But then it can never help us understand everything. And then actually we always have to drop it at some point, because we will always reach the limitation, and then we'll end up with a new theory or something like that. So when we're talking about material spiritual, when we're talking about, okay, so then we're dividing things. We're conceptualizing by creating a division between material and spiritual. That allows us to focus our mind on the material. What is that? It's actually to focus our mind on the material dimension, the material aspect, the material side of things. And then we can same thing, then we could focus on the spiritual dimension, the spiritual side of things. But that's only the side or the dimension. Ultimately, the reality is mixing, it combines the spiritual and the material. So it's just like if you have a camera and at some point you have to focus on what is close to you. And then when you focus on what's near you, then the part far away is going to be blurry. And then you focus on the part far away, and then the part near you is blurry. But the far away part and the part near you is one reality. It's not two separate realities, right? So these concepts just help us to focus on this and to focus on that. Now, the current operating system really makes us focus on the material all the time, or most of the time. So that's why we have to kind of overcompensate to a certain degree by focusing more on the spiritual. But then ultimately, we have to recognize that the two actually can't really be separated. So I think that was a really important point that a few of you made. And then the other really other important point is about what I could call internal and external inputs to the mindscape. Right. So one of you mentioned the idea that there's an external trigger. So, okay. So, okay. So again, here, because most of the time, the way we've been trained, the way we've been educated, we tend to focus on the external a lot. And not very aware of what's going on inside our mindscape and everything like that. So now I'm really bringing it in the other direction, and I'm really focusing on how so much of how we perceive the world is actually happening inside our mindscape. And that it seems like I'm almost saying that the external part has almost nothing to do with it anymore. And in that sense, it sounds almost like idealism, right? A 唯心主义, right? But actually, I don't think so. So again, I'm just trying to draw you into looking more closely at the internal mindscape, because usually that's not the way you've been educated. But actually, the external is so, again, actually, we're always in an interaction between the external and the internal, right? And that's the healthy way. That's what's healthy. So again, when we're right, we experience a material object, or we experience a material perception. It comes in, and then we give meanings to it, right? So our experience actually combines both the external and the internal. And so our mindscape is constantly, but the thing is, it can never be completely external. That's the point that I'm making, right? You never ever perceive things completely externally. But then on the other hand, you would never, or practically never, be able to experience totally internally. You're constantly receiving the input from outside. So as one of you put, in a sense, like the issue of Jack, you've got the trigger comes from outside, right? Jack started it, right? He hit you, right? So there was a trigger there. And then there are things that Jack, the way he is and the way he acts and his personality and all that, that is all a whole bunch of external elements. And then through the hitting and through that, then it goes into your mindscape. And that triggers all kinds of reactions inside yourself, right? So the energy is coming from yourself in a sense, but it is really triggered by something external. So I think this is an important, a really important point to make. And so the idea, as you mentioned, of a trigger, I think that's a very good kind of word to describe what's going on. They're external triggers, but then they trigger all kinds of energies and responses inside ourselves. Any questions or comments about that so far? Nope. Okay. So I'll go on to the next one, which is on positive and negative energies. So a few of you questioned, and these were really good points, that, well, wait a minute, because actually negative experiences could have a positive value, right? And even like, let's say let me see here. Right, like one of you wrote, for example, when we learn about the suffering of people in poor countries in the world, the cruelty of wars, the loneliness and difficulty of left behind children in Chinese rural areas, we might feel frustrated, upset, and even angry. It's no doubt that learning from others' suffering is essentially meaningful, but it's always associated with negative energy. And some people would say that they'd rather suffer the pains of wakefulness than gain the joys of ignorance. So I think this is a really, really good point. And actually, there's a couple important things there. First of all, right, that actually these negative impressions, we see these negative things, and isn't that actually a good thing, right? I mean, we shouldn't avoid negative. The world has a lot of negative things, and especially if we want to be proactive to try to do something about negative things, we have to face it, right? We shouldn't just avoid, be an ostrich, hide our head in the sand and try to just completely avoid that anything that's wrong or that's anything that's negative. So I think there that you really make a very good point. And actually, in many ways, what spurs us to action to improve our own life and to improve the life of others, to improve the life of societies, is really when we face something negative. So, okay, now, but then let's think about this a little bit more. Um, I face actually the negative inside myself. Like there's something bad inside myself, something weak inside myself. So I shouldn't run away from it, right? I should really face it, look at it. And same with society, right? Or problems that are happening in society, right? So you mentioned left behind children or wars and injustice and like that. So, okay. So don't bury your head in the sand, you face it. And this negative thing, it actually triggers a response. It triggers like, even could be anger, right? It triggers an angry response, and then you want to do something about it. And actually this is good, right? But then the question is, and here is where I think where I would put in the issue of positive and negative energy, is then how to convert that response into a positive way. So in other words, how to convert the negative into positive. So because one possible response to being faced with the negative, the looking at what's the negative things that you see outside in the world or in yourself, is to be discouraged and dejected, right? So you get influenced by that negativity, and then you just you get filled up with negative energy, because negative energy means you can't do anything. It's not energy, right? So you want positive energy, like power to do something. So then how can that be converted into a positive energy that makes you want to do something? And then what makes you want to do something positively? In other words, that can actually positively change the situation, whether it's the situation in your life or some situation in society or yourself, right? So this is the question then, how to turn that negativity into something positive, into a positive energy that makes you go out and do something constructive, whether it's for yourself or for society. So yeah, and the same thing goes for admonishments. One of you mentioned about like, well, maybe in a religious community also there are negative, like, the pastor might say, don't do this, right? Or your community might actually tell you or put pressure on you not to do something bad. So actually this kind of saying no is it's also this kind of negative input from outside. And same goes with parents, So yeah, but again, how to turn that negative restriction into something positive, so that like, then you realize that, oh yeah, that's right, I shouldn't be doing that, or I shouldn't have been doing that. So then how do you convert that into a positive, going into, behaving in a better way, right? And to do so with a positive, with a positive attitude. So I think the issue here is conversion of negative to positive, right? So it's about not being afraid of the negative, actually face the negative, deal with the negative, but then turn it into positive. If we lack the positive energy, that's when we might become afraid of the negative energy, because it overwhelms you, right? But if you have lots of positive energy, which comes from faith, right, then you're not afraid of negative energy, and you can just go into it. You can go into it and fearlessly. You can go into it fearlessly, and maybe, yeah. Then somebody talked about AQ. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, right. Right. Isn't it just like AQ Jingshan, right? Just always kind of seeing everything in such a positive light. Everything you do, you're actually losing, but you turn it into a victory, right? Just in your own mind, right? but so in Lu Xun's story, right, it's like he's just a fool, right? Because actually he's just a loser, and his attitude is stopping him from going out and doing something good, going and improving his life. And somebody else also mentioned about, or these people, like they might be religious and they're just well, they don't do anything because they're just hoping for a better afterlife, right? So they live in poverty and whatever like that, and they're not going to do anything because, well, they know they'll have, they might have a better afterlife. So I think the answer to this, it goes back to what I just mentioned, that about the interaction between the internal and external. Okay, so basically, you want to have a positive energy in order that you can go out into society, out into life, and do something positive. If you're just going to be sitting there doing nothing and just generating actually kind of creating really your own imaginary mindscape that's cut off from the world, or that has no real practical connection with the world, then you become like Akwe, or these kind of passive people. And then you're just convincing yourself that you're the best person in the world when you're actually nothing, right? So yeah, so that is actually, so I think that's so Lu Xun was right about those kind of people. But that's not the way it has to be, right? So one of you mentioned about the religious people, they become passive. Well, but I mean, look at what is one of the most religious countries in the world? It's actually the United States of America. Okay, very religious country. But nobody would say that these people are passive people who just sit around and wait until they die so they can go to heaven. Americans are not like that. They're among the most active people in the world. Now, there are a lot of problems with American society, okay? And even there's a lot of problems with American religion. Ooh, serious problems. But that's not one of the problems, right? So having a very positive mindscape, the positive energies and which often comes from faith, it actually can really be energy to go out into the world and to be more dynamic, right? And to really make a better life, and to make an even better material life, right? So what's interesting, America is materially extremely prosperous, and it's also a really religious country. Yeah. So finally, the sources of spiritual imagination. Yeah, so just a few more minutes. So maybe I'll expand this a little bit more another time. There was just a few of you, and I suppose probably you're religious, and actually you made you kind of challenged what I was saying about imagining God, right? Because, well, wait a minute here, there is a difference. I mean, you're suggesting that, well, there really is a difference between simply sitting there and meditating, an imagination of God, and actually being a real believer in God, who is, like during the Roman Empire, these Christians, they weren't just sitting around meditating about God. They believed in God, and they would not give up their faith, even if, when they were thrown and burned at the stake by the Roman Empire, right? So there's really, so you're saying, well, there's really something quite different here. And I agree with that. And here's how I'd like to suggest, though, okay? Or how you could see this. Okay, let's just imagine like meeting a girl and then getting married, okay? So even before having I'll just talk about my own life, all right? So, before I got married and before I met my beloved, okay, so I didn't know her, but I had an imagination of what a girl, what a girl is like, and what living like with a girl might be, and what would be an ideal girl, and things like that, right? So I had that kind of an imagination. And it was thanks to that imagination that I wanted to, that I was looking forward to the day that I would meet my love, right? So even before meeting the true person, there is the power of the imagination, right? If I never even thought about that, or if I'd never had that desire, then I never even go and look for or look or even consider that. Okay, but then I met her, and so then you have a real person. It's not purely imagination, right? I mean, literally, I met her. Okay, and this is another story. It's love at first sight. Okay, so I literally met my wife, and the moment I saw her, I knew I would marry her. I knew I would have my whole life with her. But actually, I didn't really know her, right? Okay, so I had to get to know her. So she's a real person. She's not an imaginary person. And yet, when I first met her, so I knew a real person there, then I was wondering, well, I was so curious about her. I wanted to know so much about her. And based on how she looked, based on her eyes, everything like that, I was starting to imagine all kinds of things about her. So she still lived primarily in my imagination and partly in reality. Then as I got to know her, then, my true knowledge of her started to expand. But still, she was very much in my imagination. And even now, it's been like 20 years. It's been more than 20 years. Than 23 years. Anyone, even that you spent your whole life with them, you never completely know them. They're still partly in your imagination, and even maybe largely in your imagination. And then when we talk, we always have to readjust our imagination of the person. So the imagination is always there. So it's there even if you've never. So let's put this toward God. It's there even if you never met God or you never met Jesus. But even after you met Jesus, it's still there too. Okay. And it goes back to the interaction between your imagination and the reality out there, right? And so when you have a relationship with a person, a relationship, right, like with my wife or my relationship with God, it's always a back and forth. And then when the relationship, but when you have through this relationship, you gain strong faith, such as I have strong faith in my wife. She has strong faith in me, because through my actions she learned to trust me, and through her actions she learned to trust me. I learned how to trust her, and she learned how to trust me. So in a religious relationship, that's how faith is also constructed, back and forth, right? Back and forth. And then the faith becomes very, very strong. And so, yeah, it's much stronger than simply sitting, like in this course for a few hours or a few minutes and imagining what God would be like, right? So for sure. And this goes to, finally, okay, we're running a little bit out of time, but I just wanted to make one other point then. So even in a relationship, and perhaps even more in a relationship with God or Jesus or Buddha or so on, there's always going to be that imaginary dimension. And even the most committed religious believers, they imagine Jesus or Buddha in different ways. And so then they act differently. So, and maybe their imagination is not a healthy one. And so some of you mentioned that, what about actually the omnipotent God? It actually might restrict our creativity and our capacities. Well, because you imagine God in that way. You imagine God in such a way that he that he kind of is this oppressive kind of figure. But is that really the way God is? And so we don't have time now, and so I'll talk about it next time. So a lot of the so simply whether God exists or not, people have imaginations of God, and whether people believe in God or not, even the believers, they imagine God in a certain way. And so they're always involved in constructing their mindscape with the way that they imagine God or the way that they imagine Jesus to be. And this actually has it has implications, has consequences. And those consequences could be very, very good, and they could be very bad. But it's not only for religious people. So it's something that we'll talk about later. You might not have God in your mindscape, but you might have made something else into something like God, such as money, such as being famous, such as, you know, a certain political ideology. So it's the same thing. And again, it's how you construct that. What is your relationship with money? It could actually be a very healthy relationship with money, but it could be a very unhealthy relationship with money that actually restricts you. So no matter what you have in your mindscape, uh, it the way you right. So the way you relate to it um, is something that we have to learn how to do, because we could relate to it in a way that is harmful, or we could relate to it in a way that's beneficial. And the same goes for something material in your, you know, or some material purpose, or right, money, or, you know, material success. That is what you put in your mindscape as your goal. Or if it's some religious, if it's a religious uh, faith, or right, if it's a God, if it's Jesus, or any other object of religious faith. So yeah, so that's the kind of point. So you guys made really, really good points, and it actually really helps me also to clarify my own thinking about this. So I really appreciate it. And I saw, you know, one of you put an open question. We have opened up that box for open questions, and I thought that one of you did so, and that was a really good question. I really liked it. So please don't hesitate to do that. And finally, then, I will wish you a happy Chinese New Year. I hope that in spite of everything, you can enjoy the new year and have a very happy year of the ox. 恭喜發財，恭喜發財。